Good morning, afternoon, and evening. It's Thursday, April 16th, and on behalf of everyone at Simulations Plus, welcome to Transporters in PBPK Modeling with GastroPlus, hosted by Ke Szeto. For optimal video and audio connection, we highly recommend you close out any additional web or streaming applications that may affect your internet bandwidth. This call is being recorded. Today's course structure will have lecture and examples, followed by a live Q&A session. So grab your coffee, tea, or water. It's going to be a very insightful 90 minutes. Now, before we get started, we do have a quick poll question. How would you classify your experience with GastroPlus software? We'll give you about 30 seconds to answer. It looks like the beginners are ahead. And just a few more seconds here. Great. So even though you might be a beginner, you're still in the right place to learn more about what's defined in a PBPK model. And for all you intermediate users, we hope you enjoy what you're going to see today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Mr. Dan O'Connor, Director of Business Development for Simulation Sciences. Take it away, Dan.
Thank you very much, Arlene, and welcome to the Workshop from Home seminars. Today we are going to all learn, myself included, a little bit more about transporters in PBPK modeling. But before we start, I thought I would share a slide that I created this morning that updates all of us as to why we're all working from home. This is the map of the current clinical trials for COVID in the world. I've been modeling this every morning, and there are 36 new trials since yesterday. So the world is in discovery mode, although we're all working from kind of remote locations. And I thought it would be just kind of interesting to look at where the clinical trials in the world are. And again, if you have an interest in the specifics of what's underway, you can check that out at clinicaltrials.gov. The reason I mentioned that slide is we are committed at Simulations Plus to providing any help that we can to any of your endeavors to help defeat COVID-19. So please do feel free to contact us if we can help in any way, either with software or consulting services. We'd be more than happy to help reduce the impact of this dread virus. Without further ado, I'd like to take a moment and introduce our speaker this morning. Ke Szeto is a principal scientist with Simulations Plus. She did her graduate work at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she received her doctorate in applied mathematics. Ke has over a decade of experience on model-based drug discovery and development, principally focused in on PK/PD, clinical pharmacology, PBPK, and QSAR modeling. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Szeto. Dr. Szeto?
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the fourth day of our at-home webinar. Today, we're going to talk about transporter-based IVIVE in PBPK modeling. So today's plan, first of all, I'm going to iterate some of the important concepts in PBPK modeling, which you probably have seen it from the first 2 days if you attended those webinars with Maxime or Vieira, such as what is the Permeability-Limited Tissue, what is a Perfusion-Limited Tissue, and what kind of model equations we used for these tissues. Then we're going to zoom in the KP calculations in GastroPlus, as being able to predict the volume distribution accurately is an important first step to ensure a later success in the modeling. After that, we'll take a look at the first-in-human distribution decision tree suggested by the members of the GastroPlus user group steering committee. So in their paper, they talked about when the default Lukacova method failed to predict the volume distribution, what other choices we can have, especially for compounds that have low permeability with possible transporter effects. Lastly, we'll use two compounds to illustrate how to use what we call the specific PStc method to achieve IVIVE for compounds that have low permeability. So let's start. We have seen this over and over again. So I'm not gonna go into the detailed explanation of this graph. What I want to focus here is to remind you when you're running a simulation, all these complicated processes are happening behind the scene. You can also tell from our name, our software's name, GastroPlus, to see how important it is to have an accurate prediction for the absorption model. So after the drug enters systemic circulation, you do have a choice of connecting it to either a compartmental model or a PBPK model. In the PBPK model, on your left is the schematic view of our model in GastroPlus. In each of the compartments, it defines a tissue model. In each of these models, we have defined the following parameters, such as the tissue volumes, the blood perfusion rate, a default expression level for the enzymes and transporters that we could find in the literature. Also, if you have used the program, you probably noticed that we have included new default level for the enzymes and transporters as the GastroPlus versions evolved. So as the new version comes out, please also check the list. We might have new enzymes and transporters there for you to use. We also include tissue compositions, such as the volume fractions of lipids and proteins for these tissues. And finally is the important parameter, the tissue plasma partition coefficient, Kp values. So these Kp values, using our models providing GastroPlus, it can be estimated from the drug property, such as the LOD versus pH, pKa's, plasma protein binding, and blood to plasma concentration ratio. If you have measurements from your animal data, you can also directly input the Kp values in our model to predict the volume distribution. Okay, next we're gonna talk about the tissue models we have in GastroPlus. Here is a schematic view of a tissue in reality. So you have three spaces in the tissues: the vascular space, the extracellular space, and intracellular space. The intracellular space is where metabolism can be happening. Sitting on top of the cellular membrane, you can set up transporters either on the basolateral side or the apical side of the membrane. So when you have a tissue such as a liver or a kidney, then you will have the access to add transporter in the apical membrane. So for liver tissue, you will have a transporter pumping the drug into the bile. Or for kidney, you will have the choice to set up the transporter, connected the kidney with a kidney tubule. There are two types model in GastroPlus we provide. First of all, is the perfusion-limited tissue. So in this case, it's usually for small lipophilic compounds. So the diffusion, the passive diffusion in the tissue is not the rate-limited step. Instead, the blood perfusion rate is the rate-limiting step. So looking at this equation, the amount of drug change in that tissue is governed by the drug going into the tissue minus the drug going out from the tissue, minus any of the clearance mechanisms can be happening. Either it's a linear clearance or an enzymatic clearance driven by the Michaelis-Menten equation. So here is the model. Here's the equation we use in the perfusion-limited model to model the amount of drug changed in that tissue. So Kp, the tissue to plasma partition coefficient, is to describe the plasma and then the whole tissue space. Here are just some of the typical plots you will see from the perfusion-limited tissue. So when you have a small tissue with a relative high blood flow, then you will see that these tissues quickly reach the equilibrium with the plasma concentration. But when you have a relatively large tissue with a slow blood flow rate, it usually takes longer for this tissue to achieve the equilibrium with the plasma concentration. So adipose and muscles are two of the examples here. Next up, if you have a more hydrophilic compound and with a larger molecular weight, then the rate limited step is not by the blood perfusion rate. It's actually the diffusion, the passive diffusion through the tissue. So we will need to consider the three space in this tissue, the vascular space, the extracellular space, and intracellular space. And then the rate limiting step will be the diffusion from the extracellular space into the intracellular space. So Kp here will be describing the partition between the plasma and extracellular space. For the diffusion in the tissue, we'll use what we call the PStc, the permeability times surface area product to describe. You can also set up the transporter to assist the transport from the extracellular space to the intracellular space. And then the model equation here, besides the extracellular space, we also have a term to describe the change of drug in the intracellular space. So you will have two equations instead of one for the permeability-limited tissues. And again, here is the plot for the view of the tissue concentrations when you use permeability-limited tissues. So the blue line is the plasma concentration. You can see that the extracellular concentration from those tissues reached equilibrium with plasma instantaneously. But for the intracellular space, it usually takes longer to reach equilibrium. So does the total tissue concentration. Next, we're going to talk about the mechanism to calculate the distribution. There are many factors will affect the distribution into the tissue, such as binding, such as the lipid partitioning, and maybe transporter effect, and maybe other factors such as lysosomal trapping. So in the new version of our 9.7, we did account for the lysosomal trapping, and I'm going to get to there in a few slides. And you can also use the measurable quantities to replace our KP calculation. As Maxime has mentioned in his talk during the first day, Simulation Plus provided a very strong QSPR model to predict the drug properties, such as lot P, lot D, pKa, Cresp solubility, and so on. So these properties can then be used to estimate the Kp values for our compound. So combining these in silico technologies in our PBPK modeling already can give you a very reliable predictions for the compound, even without running the experiments. Next, we're gonna talk about the methods we use to predict the Kp values in the program. So first of all, is the Poland and Thiel method. So in their method, they account for binding for neutral lipids, phospholipids, and partitioning into the water. So this is the equation we used in the Poland and Thiel homogeneous method. Next, we have Poland extracellular method. So in this method, we describe the partitioning only to the extracellular space. For a permeability-limited tissue, Kp is to calculate the partitioning between the plasma and extracellular space. For perfusion-limited tissue, it is used to calculate the partitioning between the plasma and the entire tissue. Next is the Blavatsky method. So in this method, they consider the same type of binding to neutral lipids, phospholipids, and water, but it's a little bit different form than the Poland and Thiel method. They made a small modification, but the bindings are similar as the Poland and Thiel method. Next is the Rodgers and Rowland method. So in their method, they use the pKa to describe two types of binding. So if your drug compound is a strong base or Swiss island with at least one base pKa greater than 7, then they will take into account for the direct unit interaction of bases with the acidic phospholipids. If you have acids, neutrals, and weak bases, then we'll take into account for the binding to the lipoproteins and tissue albumins. As you can imagine, with the sharp separation at pKa equals 7, that you will cause discontinuity in the Kp estimations. Because of that, our director, Dr. Vera Lukacova, combines both methods. So we will consider the ionization of the compound, and then the binding of the drug to acidic phospholipids or plasma proteins will be given by the actual ionization of the drug compound at the physiological pH. So you are separating the drug from the neutral fraction, acidic fraction, and cationic fraction, and then calculated the binding for each of the fractions at the physiological pH. In that way, we eliminate the sharp jump from the pKa separation at 7. So here is the comparison between the Rodgers and the Lukacova method. So as you can see in the Rodgers method, for the Kp calculations, the compound cross pKa equals 7, then you have the sharp jump, which is unrealistic, because for that small change in pKa, it shouldn't have a jump at the volume distribution estimation. With the Lukacova method, we see that we have the same predictions outside the range of 6 to 8, but have a continual change in the range of pKa 6 to 8. Finally, in the version for 9.7, we accounted for the lysosomal trapping. So before these methods came out, the way to account for lysosomal trapping in the past is to raise the RBP value in the program and calculate the KPs with the higher manually set RBP value. So with this new method, we do account for lysosomal trapping in our default methods. So there are two contributions in the lysosomal trapping. The first contribution is accumulation of the drug in the lysosomal water compartment. And also the other contribution is from binding to the acidic phospholipids in the lysosomes. So here we have two important parameters for this equation. One is the lysosomal pH. Second is the volume of the lysosomes in each of the tissues. In this paper, the authors have done great measurements. So they did provided the lysosomal measurements in the lung tissue and in the liver tissue. So kidney, they do provide some values here, but it's estimated value. So in the liver tissue, they also provided some of the measurements for the fat storing cells. So in this plot, we are able to make a relationship between the concentration of the acidic phospholipids in these tissues and the lysosomal volume fraction. So using lung, liver, and adipose tissue, we use this fat storing cells to just representing the adipose tissue. So that's the three blue dots you see from this plot. We're able to calculate or set up a relationship between the acidic phospholipids with the lysosomal volume fraction, and then place the rest of the tissue using their acidic phospholipid concentrations, and then you will be able to generate the lysosomal fractions for the remaining tissue in the PBPK model. For the lysosomal pH, they do have measurements for the lung and the liver. So we do put in these two values in our PBPK model. For the other cells, for the other tissues, we use 5.1. But you can change the lysosomal pH if you have other measurements. So here is the screenshot showing you all the methods we discussed above, including the Poland and Thiel, Borowski, Rodgers single, Rodgers and Rowland, Rodgers single, or the Lukacova equation, and also the correction with the lysosomal trapping with our default methods. Our FU intracellular method also included the lysosomal trapping correction. So when you open up the tissue compartment in our PBPK model in 9.7, you will see these two values being added in the advanced tab. It's the volume of the lysosomes and the pH of the lysosomes. So here are some validation we done with the lysosomal trapping method. The orange dots are the KPs without the lysosomal trapping. So it's using our old method. Where the blue dots are the KPs with lysosomes. So you do see shifts for it's being very obvious in some of the tissues, such as the kidney, liver, and lung, which have more lysosomal contents. And then for the final BSFS calculation, you also observed some shift in the volume distribution, especially for the strong basic compounds. So these two sets of compounds are not necessarily the same. Each of the tissues are from these two papers published by Rodgers in 2005 and 2006. And then the volume distributions are published in the Poland 2002. So these two sets of compounds are not necessarily the same. Finally, just gonna give you an example for capturing the effect of lysosomal trapping. So for this example, in the past, it's a strong basic compound. In the past, this is what we've been used, the in silico blood to plasma ratio to predict the volume distribution for IV bolus administration. So in the past, because we don't have the method to account for lysosomal trapping, the way we do it is to increase the blood to plasma ratio manually to be able to match the volume distribution. So this is the model simulation in the past with increased blood to plasma ratio. And through these years, after the papers published through these years, there are other papers that actually have a measured blood to plasma concentration ratio. So with this new measured value, the simulation is a little bit improved compared to using the in silico value for the RBP. But still, we're not catching the lysosomal trapping effect. Lastly, when we try the new equation with the lysosomal trapping, then we can see that we can calculate the volume distribution more accurately, accounting for this effect in the lysosomal compartments. Here is the summary of all the methods we provide in GastroPlus. So for Poland method and Bavarsky, we accounted for the binding. They accounted for the binding to neutral tissue lipids, binding to tissue proteins. For Poland extracellular methods, only accounting for the binding to the tissue protein. For Rodgers, also accounted for the extracellular and intracellular water partitioning and binding to the acidic phospholipids. With our default Lukacova method, we have accounted for all of the above and also simultaneous contribution of the protein and acidic phospholipid binding instead of using the separation at pKa equals 7. With the new method in 9.7, we also accounted for the lysosomal trapping. So finally, this is the equation we use in GastroPlus to calculate the volume distribution. So it will have the KPs from each of the tissues, and then ER is the tissue extraction rate, plus the VE. So this is just the erythrocyte volume, and E to P is the erythrocyte to plasma ratio plus the volume of the plasma. So this is the decision tree I mentioned previously by Dr. Miller and a number of the members in the GastroPlus user steering committees. So it is very important to be able to accurately predict the distribution for first-in-human researchers. So the first questions they're going to ask is that if our default method predicts the using the measured input data is able to predict the volume distribution accurately. If yes, we're just going to use the default methods. But when the default methods failing to predict, they also give a number of choices that you can consider. So the next question they asked here is the tissue distribution or the QWBA data available in the red, and do those data give the reasonable prediction of distribution? If yes, we're gonna go ahead and use the measured data for the human prediction. If no, then there's a number of choices that you can have here. When they published the paper in 2019, we haven't had the method for the lysosomal trapping. So usually to account for that effect, we will increase the RBP by some folds to see if we can match the VSS. So the first suggestion, the first suggestion they gave here is that thus adjusting the predicting KP values while inputs log P, pKa, FUP, or RBP can predict the volume distribution within 2 folds. So if yes, we're gonna use that adjustment and then for human prediction. If not, then is the VSS unbound value comparable across species? If yes, then we're gonna use these for human prediction. And next, if there's a consistent systemic prediction error in the preclinical species. So if yes, then we're gonna use the systematic prediction error to predict for the human. And then they also give some advice if the permeability is low. So if the permeability is low, the question they ask here is, does a permeability-limited tissue model using the extracellular Kp values with or without the specific pH, PStc work? If yes, then we're gonna use the permeability-limited tissue model with or without the specific PStc for the human prediction. And you can also consider the contribution of the transporter if it's also playing a role for that compound. So for the next, we're gonna talk about what is the specific PStc method mentioning in their paper and how does that work for low permeability compounds. So again, there are 2 types of tissue models providing in the GastroPlus. There's a perfusion-limited tissue and permeability-limited tissue. For the perfusion-limited tissue, when you have a small lipophilic molecules, the tissue can usually account well for the volume distribution predictions. So the rate of the compound, the rate of the drug accumulating in the tissues is really limited by the tissue blood flow in this for this model. And then the Kp is to describe the drug partitioning between the plasma and then the whole tissue. For the permeability-limited tissue, when you have a hydrophilic molecule and usually the larger in size, the rate of the drug accumulation in the tissue is limited by the rate of the drug transfer between the intracellular space and then the extracellular space. The Kp is to describe the partitioning between the vascular space and in the extracellular space. There's some permeability surface area product, PStc, can be used to describe the rate of the passive drug transferred between the extracellular space and intracellular space. We can also set up transporters in the basolateral membrane to describe the drug transfer. So here is just the schematic plot for the perfusion-limited tissue. Again, the Kp can be estimated from a number of the drug properties such as RBP, FUP, log P, and pKas. Combining with the tissue properties, we're able to calculate the Kp or estimate the Kp values under these assumptions. So you will have bindings to the proteins, neutral lipids, neutral phospholipids, and acidic phospholipids. For the permeability-limited tissues, then the KP is to describe the partitioning between the vascular space and intertissue space. A surface area product is going to be used to describe the passive diffusion into the tissue, or a transporter-based transfer can be used as well. So the binding is similar. You will have the binding to the proteins, binding to the neutral lipids, neutral phospholipids, and acidic phospholipids. Again, the rate limited process here is by the perfusion of the drug compound entering the intracellular space. For the liver and kidney, these two type of special tissues, you can also set up the transporters or the apical PStc value to describe the transfer of the drug into the bile, or for the kidney tissue, you can describe the drug transfer into the urine with this set of transporters. So next, we're going to talk about what is the specified PStc value and how do you use it in the in vitro in vivo extrapolations. So we know in the past that physiological-based methods for human PK predictions are reasonably well established for small lipophilic compounds. So usually the clearance is driven by the liver metabolism. However, later on in the process, when we try to optimize the compound properties to improve the metabolic stability, these usually lead to a reduction in the lipophilicity and also the permeability. So there's a shift in the clearance mechanism from the liver metabolism to transporter-mediated uptake and efflux. So these kind of shift still remains challenging when we try to model these kind of compounds. A number of different approaches in the past for this type of IVIVE has been published over the past few years. So the general consensus between these published approaches is that extrapolation will usually require additional empirical scaling factors. And then the common feature of these published models only focus on the transporter effect in the liver. They do not consider the low passive permeability might affect other tissues as well. So if we assume that the cell membranes have the same structures across different tissues, if you see low permeability in the liver tissue, we should also see low permeability in all the other tissues. So with that assumption, what we're going to use here in this method, we're going to assume all permeability-limited tissue. So the passive permeability of the drug through the cell membrane is the same in all the tissues. Here is the assumption we are making. So the only difference in this passive diffusion in these different tissues will be caused only by the difference of the surface area. So with this assumption, we can calculate the permeability surface area product for the liver. If we scale by its surface area, then we can apply this value for all the other tissues and multiply the surface area in other tissues. We'll be able to calculate the PStc value for all the other tissues. But since the surface area is usually hard to measure, it's unknown, we'll use the tissue cell volumes instead to estimate such a scaling. So here, comes to our transporter-based IVIVE. So it's more relevant for poorly permeable drugs, which has the hepatic clearance depending on the transporter uptake. Prerequisite for successful application will require this diffusional clearance measured along with the transporter Km and Vmax values. All the tissues in the PBPK model will be treated as permeability-limited tissue, so we can use the PStc value to describe the permeability in these tissues. And then we will use the liver PStc value by the in vivo measurements of the diffusional clearance, and then apply this value, dividing by the volume of the cells in the liver, then applying this value to other tissues. But of course, there's some assumption we are making here. The cell morphology, the size and the shape of the cells are similar across tissues. And also the membrane composition are similar, so that the permeability will only depend on the surface area or the volume of the cells. Here's how we do the PStc scaling. So if we assume that the cell has certain morphology, and then they are similar in size and shape, then the K factor here should be the same across the tissues. So just for a very simple case, if you are thinking about the cell has spherical shape, then this K should be related to 1 over the radius of the spherical shape. So we'll have the surface area of the cell equals K, a prefactor, times the volume of the cell. So the tissue volume will be equal to the extracellular space, the volume, plus the N is the how many cells in that tissue times the cell volume from the individual cell. And then the volume of the cells in that whole tissue will be calculated. So for each of the individual cell volume, it can be calculated as the volume of the tissue minus the volume of the extracellular space divided by number of cells in that tissue. So finally, the surface area can be calculated as M times the surface area of each of the cells. So combining the equation above, then we reach to this equation. The PStc value is the permeability times surface area. So you have permeability times the surface area that we calculate from above. Combining the first two terms and call it specific PStc, then we can see that this value is calculating from the PStc of that tissue divided by the cell volume. There are some modification for the kidney and liver because the surface area is going to split between the apical and basolateral membrane. For the kidney tissue, we just assume that the split is a 1-to-1 ratio. For liver, we're going to just assume that it's a 1-to-2 ratio between the apical and basolateral membrane surfaces. So here is the assumption we are making here. The cell have the same morphologies, the membrane composition are the same, so the path will be the same across the tissues. Using this method, you can see that we can optimize only one parameter, the specific PStc, to obtain the PStc values across for all the tissues. And then if when we try to use these across different species, the question we want to ask here is that, can we use the same parameter to extrapolate across species? If we have the same assumption, if the membrane composition are similar across species, and then the cell morphology is the same across species, then we should be able to apply the same parameters from your preclinical species to human. So we will see that in the example how this works.
Thank you, Kay. This is a good spot to check in with the audience and ask, have you ever applied specific PStc method to your research? We'll give you just a couple of seconds. Okay, so it looks like a majority of you are in the right spot to continue to learn more about the applied specific PStc method. So Kay, continue on. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is how we calculate the specific PStc value. So you will have measurements for the in vitro diffusional clearance measured in the hepatocytes. Usually it's measured together with the Vx and Km value from the transporter studies. So it will have the unit either milliliter per minute per million cells or milliliter per minute per mg of proteins. So if you multiply that value by the hepatocellularity or an additional scaling factor to scale the total protein per million hepatocytes, then we reach a value for the in vivo liver PStc. Now, of course, you need to multiply by the liver size. And then using this value, and then we can look up into our PBPK model and looked up what is the liver cell volume, defining the liver, and divided this value by the liver cell volume, you can calculate the in vivo specific PStc value in the liver, and then we can apply this value to all the other individual tissues and calculated the individual tissue PStc values. So again, we assuming in the liver there's 2/3 of the cells is basolateral in the basolateral membrane. The leftover 1/3 is in the apical membrane. For the kidney cells, we just assume the ratio is 1:1. So here comes to our first case example. So we're gonna do the Valsartan human PK with this specific PStc method in the transporter-based IVIVE. Here's some physicochemical properties of Valsartan. We do have a number of literature values. So we do have the lot D value at pH 7.4. So the lot D is relatively low in the physiological range. There are two acidic pKs, 4.73, 3.9, both acidic pKas. Solubility measured at pH 1.2. And also we do have a path value for the human, measures 1.3 times 10 to the minus 4 centimeter per second. For the literature value for the RPP for the rat, we could find a reference for it. It's 0.6. For the human, M predictor gives the prediction of 0.66. We can see that it's very close to the measurements in the rats. But in this model, we're just gonna keep the rat RPP for the human. For the FUP, we don't have measurements for the rat, but again, the human, we do have measurements of 5.9%, very close to rat value, the predicted rat value. So in this model, we're gonna keep this 5.9% for both the rat and human. Valsartan is mainly excreted in feces while the biliary excretion. So it is a substrate for the MRP2, the efflux transporters to the bile, and also the uptake transporter OATP 1B1 and OATP 1B3. So it's a substrate for both type of transporters. The renal clearance is about 30% of the total plasma clearance. So in the example we are showing here, we're gonna set up the transporters and also the renal clearance in this case study. So we're gonna take a look into our program. In the Valsartan folder, if you have downloaded the folder, we do provide an Excel file inside this folder and describing all the physicochemical properties we use for this model, and then the source where these values are from. And there's some of also the transporter informations that we use to set up the model. And then in the following tabs are the measured clinical data. So this has been a very common strategy we've been using when we model the compounds. So you will have this kind of Excel spreadsheet, have all the information summarized here for future references. So let me open up Valsartan database. So I'm gonna go back to that folder and use my GastroPlus to open. Again, you can see that the first record is just a prediction by the MN predictor 9.5. And then the second record is that I replaced the measured properties. I replaced the in silico predictions by the measured properties, or the log P's, and then the permeabilities and solubilities are entered here. If I take a look at the pKa table, you can see that we also enters the solubility versus pH profile. We did adjust the model so we can have a good prediction using our pKa-based model to match all the solubility versus pH profile. So next, we're gonna keep moving forward. So we have entered the measured values. We set up the red record here. So the IPD files already provided with the measured concentration. So it's the same profile we're seeing on this tab on your Excel file. So what we're gonna do here is that we're gonna create a red PBPK physiology, and then we're gonna describe the kidney clearance using FUP times GFR. And then we're gonna predict the first in red exposure. So go back to GastroPlus. I'm gonna create a new PBPK model. Viera had talked about these on Tuesday, so you should have seen this over and over again. So we're gonna just create the red physiology under the default weight and click Save. Then we're gonna add the PBPK and go to the kidney tissue and make sure that the filtration or clearance is calculated by FUP times GFR. Is our default method. So right now in the model, we are using all the perfusion-limited tissue for this assumption. And then next, we do have the measurements from the experiments for the MRP2 and then the OATP transporters. So we're gonna use the Km and Vmax value and also the diffusional clearance to calculate the PStc value in the liver. So go to the transporter. we're gonna add OATP. So influx in the PBPK location, and MRP2, the efflux in the PBPK location. So I'm going to put it back on OATP and do the unit converter. So my measurements for Vmax and Km are from hepatocytes, and put it on hepatocytes, and my in vitro value is unbound. It's important to match the transporter type here because it's gonna create an entry in your the PBPK tissue. So if you mismatch the transporter, you might change the type in your PBPK tissue. So for my OATP, it's a basolateral influx transporter. And then I'm gonna enter the Vmax for this transporter, 1318. The diffusional clearance 1.21. We also need to check the units. So the Vmax is picomole per minute per angioprotein. So for these OATP transporters, we don't have a default value, default expression level in the tissues. So it will tells you that we're gonna just assume that this expression level is 1 and then create a enzyme in the liver tissue. Okay. Right. So let me just transfer the OATP KMV max value. So when I click there, it tells me the basolateral transport is only available in permeability-limited tissue. And when we create a model, we use all the perfusion-limited tissue. So it asks me, do I want to switch the tissue type to be able to use this method? So I click yes. And then it will add the transporter in the liver tissue as well. For the MRP2, we're going to do the same, but the diffusional, just going to click clear the item on diffusional clearance. They didn't provide the measurements in that paper, so what we're going to assume that there's no accumulation of the drug in the hepatocytes. So we're going to use the same Vmax and Km value for these efflux transporters. So we're going to change the transporter type to the apical efflux. So now we have set up the transporters and then also calculated the specific PStc value, and we can further close and then save here. Going back to our pharmacokinetic tab, if I click on added PBPK, you can see that the liver tissue already changed the permeability-limited tissue, and a specific PStc value is calculated here. In the following slides, we do provide a calculation how this value worked. So if you can follow along, and all the values are provided here. You first of all converting the in vitro diffusional clearance into the in vivo PStc value, and also going back into the liver tissue, you can calculate the cell volume in the liver, and then the PStc divided by the cell volume will give you the value of the specific PStc, where you are seeing in this window. So first of all, we're just gonna use all perfusion-limited tissue to see how well we match the prediction. So this is sort of like a traditional way of modeling. We only consider the transporter effect in the liver and treated the rest as the perfusion-limited tissue. You can see that even the AUC is not so bad. We are close to the prediction, but we completely missed the shape of the prediction. So that's coming back to what we mentioned before. So if the permeability is an issue in the liver tissue, that it might also be an issue for all the other tissues. So next, we're gonna go to add the PBPK again. This time, we're gonna change all the tissues to permeability-limited tissue, and we're gonna use the specific PStc value we calculate from the diffusional clearance and apply to all the tissues. Now let's close up the window and recalculate the KPs and run the simulation. This time we have much better match of the calculated concentration profile and then the measured data points. You can see that the assumption works pretty well here. When we have a permeability-limited liver and then calculate that specific PStc value, we also have used the permeability-limited tissue model for all the remaining tissues and applying that PStc value in these tissues. So combining both has given us very good predictions in the rat. Now we're gonna move forward to the human. So the same thing we're gonna do for the human. We're gonna add the transporters. In that paper, they do provide measurements for the Vmax and Km value for the transporters in human hepatocytes. So we're gonna change those values using the human values to do the prediction. So next, we're gonna move to the human record. Again, here, since we don't have the blood to plasma concentration ratio, we're just gonna use the value from the rat publication. I'm gonna set up new PBPK. It's a human, 28 years old and 74 kilogram. And that the program will calculate based on this body weight. Again, we just need to make sure that the kidney has our default method FUP times GFR to calculate the filtration clearance. Now, let's go to the transporter table and adding the two transporters, OATP 1B1 and MRP2. So OATP is being the influx in the PBPK. MRP2 being the efflux in the PBPK location. Now we're going to open the unit converter again and entering the information from measurements from the human hepatocytes. So for the human hepatocytes, the Vmax is 304, Km 44.4. The diffusional clearance is 0.724. And then the angioprotein per million cells is 0.6. Okay, then we can transfer the OATP 1B1 value And again, we're going to change the liver to a permeability-limited tissue. And we're going to just take the same assumption for the MRP2 transporter. We're going to assume that there's no accumulation in the hepatocytes and using the same Vmax and Km value. Okay, and then close these and save. So if I go back to the pharmacokinetics and add the PBPK, I see the new value from the human measurements for the specific PStc. So you can follow the same calculation as we mentioned before to see how this value is obtained. Now we're just gonna change all the tissue to permeability limited. So we see from the rat model that our assumption works. So if the liver is subject to low permeability, then other tissues should also have the low permeability in those tissues. And then in vitro value works for the rat. So let's see how it works for the human case. Okay, now we recalculate the KPs and then gonna run the simulation. So for the first in human predictions, this comes up to be a very good result. And you can see the profile, the shape of profile matches, and also the AUC within the two-fold of the arrows. So using a permeability-limited tissue with the PStc value works from our preclinical species to human prediction. The next example we're gonna look at is tobramycin. So I'm just gonna have a few minutes and finish this example. So in this case, the tobramycin is majorly cleaned by the renal clearance. So we're gonna set up FUP times GFR. But then for this example, we're gonna do cross species because this value is not, the diffusional clearance is not available from the preclinical species or human. So what we're gonna do here is assuming the average cell size is similar in different species, and we're gonna assume that the diffusion through the membranes is similar in different species. So we're gonna fit the value with the rat record and then validate it using the dog for this value, moving forward using the same value to predict for human. So here are some physicochemical properties for tobramycin. It's really low log P value, pretty low permeability. So for the RBP, we do assume that it's 0.55 because of the physical chemical properties of the compound. So we just assume that there's no penetration in the red blood cells. For the FUP, I was able to find the FUP value for the human. So this is the same value going to be used for both the rat and human. Again, let me open the Excel spreadsheet. For the tobramycin folder, so we do provided all the clinical data here. So we have a rat and then different formulation for the dog, and then also a human IV bolus and IV infusion record to validate. So going back to GastroPlus, I'm gonna open tobramycin. So we have already set up the records here. We'll go to the red record. I'm gonna set up the red using the body weight it provides here. So go to the pharmacokinetics, gonna click new PBPK and then create a red record, and body weight is 0.232. Okay. Now I'm gonna just go edit PBPK and make sure the filtrational clearance is set up correctly in the kidney tissue. And I'm gonna just do a prediction with all perfusion-limited tissue. You can see that using the default methods, we really missed the prediction for the volume distribution. So the AUC is not so bad for the AUC infinity, but then the shape is completely wrong. So because we know this compound is a low permeability compound, so we will try to use a specific PStc value with all permeability limited tissue to calculate. So we're just changing that. We can see how this prediction changes. So I recalculate Kp values with all the permeability-limited tissues. Now we have a much better match in the PK profiles. Next, I can do is to optimize this a little bit better with my optimization. So I'm gonna go to the modules and optimization, choose the specific PStc value from pharmacokinetics. We haven't really talked about these optimization schemes, but there are different objective function ways you can choose from. Our default is 1 over y hat square, but the unity and the 1 over y plus y hat square are also it's our favorite choices when you optimize the predictions. Okay, so we're gonna finish and then let the program run a little to find the best value for the specific PStc. So to iterate again, for this example, we don't have any measurements for the diffusional clearance from the in vitro experiments. So we're gonna assume that all the membranes have a similar structure, and then the cells are similar in shape and size across different species. That's why we want to fit the specific PStc value in the rats, and then hopefully this value will work with our assumption for other species, and eventually let us to model to predict for human. I'm gonna wait a little bit until the simulation to finish.
While we're waiting for that, Kay, we'll go ahead and ask a quick questions. Which modules within GastroPlus have you used or have access to? You can choose all that apply, and we'll give you a couple of seconds here. In today's examples and presentation, Kay has touched on the PBPK module, the metabolism and transporter and optimization, so that might look familiar to a few of you. All right, just a couple of seconds here before we close out the poll. Thank you for everyone for answering. Great. I'm glad to see a lot of you have used or have access to PBPK. Kay, we'll send it right back to you.
Thank you, Arlene. Okay, so the optimization has converged, and then we're gonna save that value to our database. So just click yes, and then we're gonna run the simulation. So we now have a better match for our red profile, and then we're gonna take the optimized values to move forward to see how it predicts for our dog species. So I'm gonna move to the next record. I probably don't have time to do all of it, so I'm just gonna do probably just one record. So we're gonna create the dog record. It's 20 kilos dog. It's a little bigger in size. Okay, and saved. Again, I'm going a little bit faster here. So I'm gonna do the edit PBPK. We're gonna change all the tissues to perfusion-limited model and make sure the kidney is set up with FUP times GFR. We're gonna use specific PStc value. For that value, we can go back to the previous record to find out, or we can do view edit tables. So I don't know if we have ever touched this function here, but you can see that going to the all the way to the end of the table, we can find the specific PStc value here. If we will right click on this value, we can update all the rows with the fitted value. Then we can save these. Now, if you click Edit PBPK, you can see this value is imported here correctly. And we're gonna click on Calc KP and run the simulation for the dog. So you can do you can test for the next two formulation for the dog, and you can see how well this assumption works for our dog species, and then move forward to human. So again, I'm just gonna do one human record here because we're running out of time. So for these IV administrations, the body weight is 78. We're gonna create a new PBPK. Human, 3 years old, 78 kilos. And save. And then add the PBPK and change all the tissue models to permeability-limited tissue and use the specific PStc value from the fitted from the red. Okay, and then save, closed, and then recalculate the KP. So for this value, using fitted with the red data, we can see how well it actually works for the human record. Moving forward, if you want to use the human, so we do have one more record here, the last record being the pediatric. So when you're moving from the human adult to pediatrics, there might be further modification or refinement you want to do with your adult model before you're moving to model the pediatrics. But here with these results, we summarize this example so you can see how well this specific PStc method has been working across different tissue type, across the different species. If you have measurements for the diffusional clearance from different species, we can calculate the in vivo values from those in vitro experiments and apply directly for the relevant species. But if you don't have that value, if your compound is a low permeability compound, and if we just make assumption that cell morphologies are similar, the membrane compositions are similar. Using this assumption, you can move forward with a specific PStc value, try to predict across the different animal species, which we illustrate with the tubomycin example here. So for the last few slides, we do have these case studies, that's transporter-based IVIVE from animals, and then we're able to predict for adults, and then moving forward to the pediatric predictions. When we, as I mentioned before, when you're moving from adults to pediatrics, there might be some uncertainties in the pediatrics you want to sort out further, such as the ontogeny of the transporters might not be available in pediatrics. So you might need to look up for more information to be able to predict the pediatric population accurately. But those are summarized in these posters, and you can take a look later after the webinar. So with that, thank you for your attention, and we are open to the Q&A section.